A delivery driver found a malnourished child and immediately called an ambulance. That action caused his life to enter a new chapter. It was a typical night in Baron Garrett's life, the man scraping by on odd delivery jobs. Yet, as his shift wound down, something about his final stop felt different. Baron couldn't quite put his finger on it, but there was a heaviness in the air, a strange foreboding that sent a chill down his spine. As he pulled up to the house, the street seemed unnaturally quiet, as though it had been forgotten by the world. The silence pressed down like a weight, filling the air with a sense of abandonment. Parking his car, Baron took a deep breath before approaching the door, unaware that the moment he was about to face would leave a lasting mark on his soul. He rang the doorbell and waited. Light footsteps shuffled inside before the door creaked open. What greeted him froze him in place. A boy, Ethan, stood before him, but he was no ordinary child. Ethan's skin was ghostly pale, as if sunlight hadn't touched him in weeks, and his eyes carried a sorrow far too heavy for someone so young. Baron's heart twisted as he took in the boy's frail frame, his arms so thin they seemed ready to snap. Ethan looked like a shadow of himself, a child whose spirit had been crushed under an unbearable weight. "Are you okay, kid?" Baron asked, his concern breaking through the professional facade he usually maintained. The words tumbled out before he could think, but deep down, he already knew the answer wouldn't ease the knot in his chest. Ethan shrugged, his small shoulders barely lifting. "Yeah, everything's fine," he said curtly, snatching the food package without meeting Baron's gaze. His tone was detached, his movements mechanical, as if he had grown accustomed to brushing off concern. Before Baron could say another word, the door shut with a dull thud, leaving him standing in the cold evening air. For a moment, Baron stood frozen on the porch, the image of Ethan burned into his mind. The boy's lifeless eyes and emaciated frame replayed over and over, each detail deepening the pit of unease in Baron's gut. Something was wrong in that house, terribly wrong, and the silence behind the door seemed to scream for help. Returning to his car, Baron felt as if he were moving through molasses. The sense of urgency gnawed at him, making it impossible to focus. He started the engine, but his thoughts were fixated on Ethan. How could someone let a child get to this state? He muttered under his breath, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. There was a desperation in Ethan's hollow expression, a silent cry that demanded attention. Baron had delivered meals to countless homes, but this encounter was different. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had stumbled upon something profoundly wrong. The drive home, which usually passed in a blur, felt agonizingly slow. The quiet streets mirrored the storm of thoughts swirling in his mind. He couldn't forget the boy's face, the way he looked resigned, as though hope was a foreign concept. As the night wore on, Baron lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. The image of Ethan haunted him, his mind racing with unanswered questions. What had I just seen? He wondered. Ethan wasn't just a neglected child. He was a soul crying out for help in a world that had turned its back on him. The thought was unbearable. Baron had seen children in need before, but this felt different. The neglect was palpable, not just in the boy's appearance, but in the emptiness that surrounded him. The house, the street, the boy, everything about the encounter screamed danger. Baron's instincts told him that Ethan was in trouble, and the longer he ignored the feeling, the stronger it became. That night, sleep eluded him. Every time he closed his eyes, Ethan's gaunt face and hollow stare would reappear, more vivid than before. Baron knew he couldn't just move on, not this time. Something had to be done. But what? He wasn't sure he was ready to face the answers his heart was leading him toward. The unease lingered well into the next day. As the sun rose, Baron found himself unable to shake the thought of returning to that house. He had no plan, no clear idea of what he could do, but one thing was certain: Ethan needed help, and Baron couldn't walk away from that responsibility. The minutes dragged on, but Baron Garrett couldn't shake the nagging feeling that what he'd witnessed at that house wasn't something he could just walk away from. He needed answers, needed to understand why Ethan, that frail boy, was living in such a desperate state. Sleep eluded him that night, and by the time dawn broke, Baron's resolve had solidified. He would go back to that house and find out the truth. The morning sun was bright, but it did little to lighten the weight in Baron's chest as he drove to the address etched in his memory. Parking his car at the curb, he inhaled deeply, summoning his courage before stepping out. Each step toward the door seemed heavier than the last. He knocked firmly and waited, this time hearing faint noises on the other side. The door creaked open, revealing Ethan, his small frame and weary expression much the same as the day before. But something in the air was different, a subtle shift Baron couldn't quite place. "Hi, Ethan," Baron greeted him gently, mustering a smile he hoped would put the boy at ease. The discomfort in the air was palpable. "Are your parents around? I'd like to speak with them." Ethan hesitated, his gaze fixed on the ground. Finally, in a voice softer than Baron expected, he replied, "They're not. Do you want to come in?" Baron froze, startled by the unexpected invitation. His first instinct was to decline, but there was no malice or danger in Ethan's tone, only resignation. After a moment's pause, Baron nodded. "All right." Crossing the threshold, Baron was unprepared for what he saw. The living room was in complete disarray, clothes scattered haphazardly, furniture askew, and a pervasive sense of neglect. No food, no semblance of order. The house felt abandoned, not just physically but emotionally, a reflection of the boy who lived there. "Ethan," Baron began cautiously, scanning the chaos around him. "What's going on here? Where are your parents?" Ethan seemed oddly composed, as though he'd been through this conversation in his mind many times. "They don't care much," he said plainly, the sadness in his words masked by an unsettling matter-of-factness. "They leave a lot. I don't know when they'll be back. Sometimes there's food, sometimes there isn't. But I get by." Baron's heart clenched. "You get by? What do you mean?" His voice faltered slightly as he pressed, "How old are you, Ethan?" 9, Ethan replied, his tone detached, his expression distant. Baron swallowed hard. How could a child of 9 be left to fend for himself in such conditions? The state of the house mirrored the boy's emotional landscape, abandoned, crumbling, bereft of care. Passing by the kitchen, Baron caught a glimpse of the nearly empty refrigerator, its contents sparse and dusty. "This isn't right, Ethan," Baron said firmly, though his voice trembled with emotion. "You can't live like this." Ethan looked up at him, his vacant eyes conveying the numb acceptance of someone too young to understand, but too old to hope. "I'm used to it." "No one should get used to this," Baron said, his voice thick with sadness and anger. The boy shrugged again, signaling the end of the conversation, but for Baron, it was just the beginning. He knew he couldn't turn away. The gravity of the situation demanded action. As Baron tried to collect his thoughts, the sound of a key turning in the lock jolted him. The door swung open, and 2 adults entered with heavy, hurried steps, Jackson and Cheryl, Ethan's parents. Their faces were etched with irritation, as if even returning home was an unwelcome burden. "Who the hell are you?" Jackson barked, his tone laced with disdain. His eyes narrowed as he took in the sight of a stranger standing in his living room. Baron squared his shoulders, his discomfort evident, but his resolve stronger. "My name is Baron Garrett. I'm a delivery driver. I came by yesterday and I was worried about Ethan. I decided to check in today." Cheryl's eyes hardened as she snapped, "Why are you in my house? Who do you think you are?" Baron stood his ground. "I didn't mean to intrude, but when I came yesterday, Ethan didn't look well. After seeing the state of this house, I'm deeply concerned. There's barely any food, and he's clearly not getting the care he needs." Jackson let out a dry laugh, crossing his arms. "And what? You're some kind of doctor now? Or maybe a social worker? You don't know us or what we've been through. You've got no right to make accusations." "I'm not here to judge you," Baron replied, his voice calm but unwavering. "I'm here because a 9-year-old boy is living in conditions no child should endure." The confrontation escalated as Cheryl stepped closer, her anger bubbling over. "We take care of him in our own way. He's our son. You don't get to tell us how to raise him." Before Baron could respond, Ethan, who had been quietly observing, suddenly collapsed. The dull thud of his small frame hitting the floor froze the room. "Ethan!" Baron cried, rushing to the boy's side. Kneeling beside him, he gently shook him. "Stay with me, kid. You're going to be okay." Jackson scoffed. "He's fine. This happens sometimes. It's nothing serious." Baron's voice was steely as he retorted, "This is far from fine. He needs medical attention now." Pulling out his phone, Baron dialed 911, his hands trembling but determined. "I need an ambulance immediately. A child has collapsed and his condition is critical." The moments that followed were a blur of flashing sirens and tense exchanges. As the paramedics carried Ethan to safety, Baron knew one thing for certain. He wouldn't leave this boy to face his struggles alone. Baron Garrett could feel the tension mounting with every passing second as Cheryl's expression turned icy and defensive. "What are you doing in my house?" she snapped, her irritation sharp enough to cut the air. Her gaze flickered briefly to Ethan, but it lacked any sign of motherly concern. Instead, she appeared more annoyed that her peace had been disturbed. Baron held his ground, his voice calm but firm. "Look, I didn't mean to overstep, but when I was here yesterday, I saw Ethan. He didn't look well. And now, seeing the state of this house, I'm genuinely worried about him. There's hardly any food here, and the boy is clearly malnourished." He kept his tone measured, but each word felt heavier than the last. He wasn't sure how Jackson and Cheryl would react, but he knew he couldn't stay silent. Someone had to speak up for Ethan. Jackson stepped forward, arms crossed tightly over his chest, a condescending smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Oh, so you're a doctor now? Or maybe some kind of social worker? Listen, buddy, you don't know a thing about us, and you've got no right barging in here and throwing around accusations." His tone was mocking, but the fire in his eyes was unmistakable. Baron didn't flinch. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him, but his resolve didn't waver. "I know this might seem intrusive, and I'm not here to judge, but the truth is, Ethan needs help. He's weak. He told me he sometimes doesn't have enough to eat." His words acted like a spark in dry brush, igniting Cheryl's anger. She stormed closer, narrowing the space between them, her voice rising. "What are you trying to say? That we're not taking care of him? We do things our way. He's our son, and you have no business butting in." Her fury filled the room, stifling any chance for rational conversation. Baron took a steadying breath, trying to keep his composure as the situation spiraled further out of control. "I'm not accusing you of anything. I'm just saying that no child should live like this. He needs basic care, and from what I can see, he's not getting it. Jackson's patience snapped. He marched forward, his face twisted in rage, pointing an accusing finger directly at Barron. "You're going to leave my house. Now. Do you hear me? Or do we need to make this a bigger issue?" His voice was a low, menacing growl, the kind that made adrenaline surge and hearts race. Cheryl moved to stand beside her husband, a united front of hostility, as if they were ready to physically remove Barron if he didn't comply. But before anyone could act, the air shifted abruptly. Ethan, who had been silent and still through the escalating confrontation, suddenly stumbled forward. His eyes rolled back, and he collapsed to the floor with a soft yet haunting thud. The room froze. For a moment, it was as though the world had stopped spinning. "Ethan!" Barron's voice cracked with panic as he rushed to the boy's side, kneeling beside him. He shook Ethan gently, desperation seeping into his every word. "Ethan, can you hear me? Stay with me, buddy." Ethan's skin was alarmingly cold, and his small, frail frame showed no sign of stirring. Cheryl clasped her hand over her mouth, her wide eyes betraying shock, while Jackson remained rigid, unwilling to acknowledge the severity of the situation. "He's just tired," Jackson muttered dismissively. "It's nothing serious. He's fainted before. This isn't your problem." But Barron wasn't having it. His voice cut through Jackson's denial with an urgency that couldn't be ignored. "He needs medical help. Right now. You can't keep brushing this off. This could be life-threatening." His tone was resolute, and the truth hung heavy in the air. Ethan's fragile body sprawled on the floor, the chaos and neglect evident in every corner of the house, and his parents' inability or unwillingness to act painted a stark picture of reality. Barron's chest tightened as he looked between Jackson and Cheryl, their control over the situation slipping through their fingers. "If you won't call 911, I will," Barron declared, his voice steady with resolve. "And I'll be calling the police too. I'm not leaving this boy in this condition." The room felt suffocating, the weight of the moment pressing down on everyone. Barron's determination was unshakable. Ethan's life was on the line, and he wasn't about to back down. Without waiting for a response, Barron reached for his phone, his fingers trembling slightly as he dialed. "I need an ambulance," he said firmly into the receiver. "It's a child. He's unconscious, and it's serious." As he spoke, Cheryl's facade began to crack. "He'll be okay, right?" "He always bounces back," she murmured, more to herself than anyone else, her voice shaky with uncertainty. Meanwhile, Jackson stood stiffly, his face a mask of stubborn denial, arms crossed as if blocking out reality. Barron stayed focused on Ethan, silently vowing that he wouldn't let the boy be another statistic of neglect. Help was on the way, and this was just the beginning of a fight Barron knew he couldn't walk away from. "I'm not going to let you keep doing this," Barron Garrett declared, his voice unwavering and firm. There was no room left for hesitation. Ethan's well-being was the only thing that mattered now. The tension in the room was stifling, and Barron knew the situation was on the verge of boiling over. Every second felt like an eternity as he glanced at Ethan's frail, unconscious body on the floor. The boy was living proof that something was gravely wrong in this household, and Barron couldn't bring himself to walk away. The desperation gnawing at Barron's chest grew heavier as he knelt beside Ethan. There was no time to waste. Without waiting for any response from Jackson or Cheryl, he pulled his phone from his pocket with trembling fingers and dialed 911. "I need an ambulance immediately," he said, his voice filled with urgency. "It's a child. He's fainted and he's in critical condition." The atmosphere in the room was unbearably tense, though Barron did his best to remain composed. Still, the fear and anguish etched on his face were impossible to hide. As Barron spoke to the dispatcher, Cheryl began to crack under the pressure. "He'll be okay, won't he? He always recovers," she mumbled, though her words sounded more like a feeble attempt to convince herself than anyone else. Jackson, however, remained stiff and detached, arms crossed and his expression hardened. He seemed determined to downplay the seriousness of the situation, unwilling to face reality. Barron blocked them both out, focusing solely on Ethan. Every second that passed without medical attention felt like a lifetime, and guilt clawed at Barron's thoughts, guilt that he hadn't intervened sooner. Finally, the distant wail of sirens broke through the suffocating tension. Barron felt a flicker of relief, though it was fleeting. He kept his eyes locked on Ethan, lightly touching the boy's shoulder as if willing him to show any sign of consciousness. "It's going to be okay, kid. Help is almost here," Barron murmured softly, the words more for his own reassurance than Ethan's. When the paramedics arrived, Barron stepped back to give them space, though his heart remained tethered to what would happen next. They worked quickly, assessing Ethan's condition and preparing him for transport. One paramedic glanced at Barron and said, "He's extremely dehydrated and very weak, but we'll get him the care he needs immediately." Barron nodded, but the lump in his throat kept him from speaking. He watched as they placed Ethan on a stretcher and carried him out, leaving behind a heavy, oppressive silence in the house. Yet, Barron knew this wasn't the end of the ordeal. Moments later, another siren echoed down the street. This time, it was the police. Barron's heart pounded as two officers entered, their expressions serious as they surveyed the chaos around them. "We received a report of suspected child neglect," one officer announced, his tone firm and direct. Jackson and Cheryl, frozen in place moments earlier, suddenly sprang to life. "This is absurd. We're his parents," Jackson barked, his voice filled with indignation. "You have no right to accuse us of this." He gestured angrily, as if trying to deflect the gravity of the situation. Barron stepped forward, his voice calm but resolute. He explained what had happened, Ethan's condition, the disarray in the house, the lack of food, and the boy's sudden collapse. The officers listened intently, one of them jotting down notes as Barron spoke. Jackson, however, continued his tirade, accusing Barron of trespassing and insisting they were being unfairly treated. But Cheryl's demeanor shifted. The defiance in her eyes was replaced by fear, a silent acknowledgement that their charade could no longer hold up. The officers began questioning Jackson and Cheryl directly while inspecting the house. Evidence of neglect was everywhere, the disheveled state of the rooms, the empty fridge, and the overall signs of a home void of care. Jackson remained combative, refusing to cooperate, but Cheryl began stammering excuses. "We've been busy. It's not always like this," she muttered, her voice lacking conviction. Barron stayed silent, observing as the reality of their neglect unraveled. The officers' questions grew sharper, and the evidence became undeniable. "You are under arrest for suspected child neglect," one officer announced as he handcuffed Jackson. Another officer did the same with Cheryl, despite her weak protests. As the police led Ethan's parents away, Barron stood in the middle of the chaos, taking a shaky breath. Relief mingled with sadness. Relief that Ethan was finally on the path to safety, and sadness for all the boy had endured. But Barron knew this wasn't the end. Ethan's journey to healing was just beginning, and Barron silently vowed he wouldn't abandon him now. The evidence of neglect was undeniable. The disarray, the empty cupboards, and the clear signs of abandonment painted a grim picture of Ethan's life. Jackson, refusing to admit any wrongdoing, erupted in anger, yelling that the accusations were baseless. Cheryl, visibly distraught, stammered weak excuses, her voice faltering under the weight of the situation. "We've been busy. It's not always like this," she mumbled, but her words lacked sincerity and conviction. As the confrontation unfolded, Baron Garrett stood silently, observing the inevitable collapse of the two people who had allowed their son to reach such a dire state. "You're under arrest for suspected child neglect," one officer announced, snapping handcuffs onto Jackson, while another restrained Cheryl. Jackson's protests echoed through the cluttered room, but there was nothing he could say to undo the reality of what had transpired. The officers led the couple out, leaving Baron alone amidst the turmoil, taking deep, shaky breaths as the chaos finally began to settle into a semblance of order. Watching the police escort Jackson and Cheryl away, Baron was flooded with mixed emotions. Relief washed over him, knowing Ethan would finally receive the care he so desperately needed. Yet, there was an undercurrent of deep sorrow for the suffering the boy had endured. Baron understood that this was only the beginning. With the authorities now involved, there was no telling how the situation would unfold. But one thing was crystal clear. Baron wouldn't abandon Ethan to face it alone. Without a second thought, Baron climbed into his car and followed the ambulance to the hospital. The flashing red and blue lights reflected off his windshield as he drove, his mind racing with questions. How could a child so young be forced to endure such neglect? How had things spiraled so far out of control? The weight of Ethan's plight pressed heavily on his heart, and Baron knew that, while the boy's struggle was far from over, he couldn't bring himself to walk away now. When Baron arrived at the hospital, he parked hastily and hurried to the entrance, his pulse still pounding from the events of the day. The image of Ethan on the stretcher haunted him, his frail, malnourished body a painful reminder of the hardships he had endured. As Baron entered the lobby, he approached the reception desk, his voice trembling with urgency. "The boy who was just brought in, Ethan. How is he?" he asked. The receptionist quickly entered the details into the computer before replying, "He's being treated right now. Please have a seat, and we'll update you as soon as possible." Baron nodded and made his way to the waiting area, where he sank into a chair, anxiety gnawing at him with every passing moment. The sterile smell of disinfectant filled the air, mingling with the distant sounds of hurried footsteps and hushed conversations. Despite the controlled chaos of the hospital, Baron felt an overwhelming sense of helplessness as he waited. Images of Ethan's house, the mess, the emptiness, the boy's lifeless expression played over and over in his mind. He had done what he could, but was it enough? After what felt like an eternity, a doctor finally approached him. The man's expression was serious, but not without a glimmer of reassurance. "Are you responsible for Ethan?" the doctor asked. Baron hesitated, the technicality of the question giving him pause. He wasn't officially responsible, but at that moment he felt more connected to Ethan than he had to anyone in years. "I'm here for him," he replied, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. "How is he?" The doctor took a deep breath before responding. "Ethan was severely malnourished, but we've managed to stabilize him. He'll need time to recover physically. However, what concerns us most is his emotional well-being. Children in situations like this often need more than medical treatment. They need long-term care and emotional support." Those words hit Baron like a blow to the chest. He had already grasped the gravity of Ethan's condition, but hearing it from a medical professional gave the situation an even sharper edge. The neglect Ethan had suffered wasn't just physical. It had robbed him of safety, stability, and love. "Can I see him?" Baron asked, his voice softer now, as if bracing himself for what he might find. The doctor gave a slight nod. Of course, he's resting, but you can sit with him. Baron followed the doctor down the quiet hallway to Ethan's room. As he stepped inside, his heart clenched at the sight of the boy lying in the hospital bed, his small frame hooked up to monitors and IVs. The room was dimly lit, the only sounds the rhythmic beeping of machines and the faint hum of hospital activity in the distance. Baron approached the bed slowly, taking a seat in the chair beside it. Ethan's face, pale and worn, seemed peaceful in sleep, though Baron knew it was the kind of exhaustion that came from years of neglect and hardship. Leaning forward, he whispered softly, "You're safe now, Ethan. You're going to be okay." Though the boy didn't stir, Baron felt a sense of resolve settle over him. This was just the beginning of Ethan's journey, but Baron was determined to see it through. Ethan deserved a chance at a better life, and Baron was ready to fight for it, no matter how long it took. The doctor gave Baron Garrett a small nod and gestured for him to follow to the room where Ethan was resting. As Baron stepped inside, an overwhelming tightness gripped his chest. Ethan lay on the hospital bed, fragile and pale, with tubes connected to his body. His eyes were closed, not in peaceful sleep, but in an exhaustion that seemed bone-deep. The quiet hum of medical monitors was the only sound in the room, amplifying the somber atmosphere. Baron moved closer, his heart heavy with emotions he hadn't expected to feel for someone he'd just met. Ethan looked so tiny in that bed, so adrift in a world that had clearly failed him. "Hey, buddy, you're going to be okay," Baron murmured softly, almost as if trying to convince himself. It was a whisper meant for both Ethan and his own restless thoughts. As he stood by the bedside, Baron decided he wouldn't leave. He'd stay, even if all he could do was be a quiet presence. In the days that followed, Baron returned to the hospital regularly. Over time, he started noticing subtle signs of improvement. Ethan began to wake up more frequently. Though still weak, he began to recognize Baron's familiar face. Their interactions were brief at first, but even the smallest responses gave Baron hope. "Are you hungry?" Baron would ask, keeping his questions simple and gentle. "A little," Ethan would reply faintly, but it was enough to show he was beginning to engage. For Baron, this was progress, small but deeply meaningful. As the days turned into weeks, Baron observed something that tugged at his heart. Ethan wasn't just physically fragile, he was emotionally shut off. It was as though the boy had constructed an invisible wall around himself, a defense against further hurt. When Baron sat beside him, Ethan would often stare off into space, his mind seemingly far away. He rarely spoke, and when he did, it was in cautious, guarded words. But Baron wasn't the type to give up. He understood that healing wouldn't come overnight, and was determined to give Ethan the time and patience he needed. During one visit, Baron leaned forward, his voice steady, but filled with warmth. "You know, Ethan, you don't have to do this alone. I'm here, and I'll keep coming back." For the first time, Ethan turned to look directly at Baron. He didn't say a word, but his eyes held something Baron hadn't seen before. A quiet gratitude, a small flicker of hope. It was a tiny step forward, but Baron knew that every step mattered on this long and challenging road. As their bond deepened, Ethan gradually began to trust Baron. The once stoic silence gave way to brief but heartfelt conversations. Ethan spoke a little more with each passing day, and Baron felt as though he was finally breaking through the boy's defenses. Weeks turned into months, and Baron became a steady figure in Ethan's life, a role the boy had never experienced before. Though Ethan's physical health was improving, the emotional scars remained visible. He rarely smiled, and his words were often tinged with hesitation. Yet, when Baron was near, There was a glimmer of trust in Ethan's eyes, something that had likely been absent during his years with Jackson and Cheryl. Barron knew he couldn't abandon him now. One day, during a routine visit, a social worker approached Barron, asking to speak with him privately. In a quiet room, her face serious but kind, she began, "Mr. Garrett, we need to discuss Ethan's future." Her tone made Barron's stomach tighten. He had anticipated this moment, but wasn't prepared for the weight of what she would say next. "Ethan's parents are facing serious neglect charges," she explained, "and he can't return to their care. The question is, where will he go from here?" The question lingered, heavy and unanswered, as Barron felt the enormity of the situation settle over him. "Does Ethan have any family who could take him in?" he asked, though he already knew what the answer would be. The social worker shook her head gently. "No. And the circumstances are complicated. We've seen the connection you've built with Ethan, and we'd like to ask if you'd consider becoming his temporary guardian until a permanent solution can be arranged." The proposal caught Barron off guard. He was just a food delivery driver, an ordinary man with a modest life. The idea of becoming a guardian to a child, a responsibility he'd never imagined taking on, filled him with doubt. A flood of questions raced through his mind. "Am I capable of doing this? How can I give Ethan what he needs?" I don't know," Barron finally admitted, his voice tinged with uncertainty. "I care about him deeply, but I'm not sure I'm the right person for this. My life is far from perfect." The social worker offered a reassuring smile. "We understand this is a big decision, Mr. Garrett. You don't have to answer right away. But right now, Ethan needs stability and care, and you've already shown that you're someone he can trust. Temporary guardianship isn't permanent, but it's a crucial step in ensuring his well-being." As the conversation ended, Barron left the room deep in thought. The weight of the decision pressed on him, but he couldn't shake the image of Ethan's wary but hopeful gaze. Over the next few days, Barron couldn't think of much else. Every moment spent with Ethan reminded him of how much the boy had endured and how much he still needed. By the end of the week, Barron made his decision. Picking up the phone, he called the social worker. His voice was steady, though his heart raced. "I'll do it. I'll take temporary guardianship of Ethan. He deserves a chance, and I can't walk away now." With those words, Barron's life changed forever. He had no idea what the future would hold, but one thing was clear. He was ready to fight for Ethan's chance at a better life. Was he ready for such a monumental responsibility? Could he truly provide Ethan with the care and support the boy so desperately needed? I don't know," Barron Garrett admitted, his voice thick with uncertainty. "I want to help, of course. But am I really the right person for this?" His thoughts churned with self-doubt. "I can barely manage my own life," he murmured. Being thrust into a position this critical was overwhelming, and the idea of becoming Ethan's guardian filled him with trepidation. Yet, deep down, Barron couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that he might be the only person willing to step up. The social worker, recognizing his inner turmoil, gave him a moment to process. "We understand this is a big decision, Barron," she said gently. "You don't need to decide right now. But Ethan needs a stable home, someone who genuinely cares for him. From what we've seen, you've already shown that care. Temporary custody isn't a permanent commitment, but it would give him someone reliable during this transition." Barron stared out the window, his emotions swirling. The social worker's words echoed in his mind. His gut told him that walking away would mean perpetuating the same neglect Ethan had already endured. The pain in the boy's eyes haunted him, a silent plea for someone to care. And yet, his own doubts loomed large. Would he be enough? Could he truly give Ethan what he needed? After several moments of introspection, Baron finally looked up, his expression a blend of apprehension and resolve. "I need time to think about this," he said earnestly. "I don't want to make a decision I'm not ready for, but I care deeply about Ethan. The last thing I want is for him to suffer more." The social worker nodded with understanding. "Take all the time you need, Baron. This isn't an easy choice." In the days that followed, Baron couldn't focus on anything but the proposal. Every hospital visit, every interaction with Ethan deepened his bond with the boy. Slowly but surely, Ethan began to open up. One quiet afternoon, the boy's timid voice broke through the silence. "You're going to keep coming, right?" he asked, his eyes filled with a vulnerability that tugged at Baron's heart. In that moment, Baron knew his decision was already made, even if he hadn't spoken it aloud. By the end of the week, he picked up the phone and called the social worker. "I want to accept temporary custody of Ethan," he said, his voice steady, yet weighted by the enormity of the responsibility. "I know it's going to be tough, but I can't just leave him alone. He deserves better than that." On the other end, the social worker's tone brightened. "I'm so glad to hear that, Baron. We'll start the paperwork right away." As Baron hung up, he felt a mixture of relief and anxiety. His life was about to take a dramatic turn, but looking at Ethan, he knew there was no alternative. This child had already endured too much neglect. It was time for someone to show him the love and care he deserved. The first few days with Ethan at Baron's house were filled with uncertainties and adjustments. Everything seemed new and different. The responsibility of raising a child now colored every moment of Baron's day, from preparing breakfast to ensuring bedtime routines. At first, the weight of it all felt daunting, but with each passing day, a sense of purpose began to grow within him. Mornings became less about his own tasks and more about creating a sense of security for Ethan. Though the boy remained cautious and reserved, Baron made it his mission to foster an environment of warmth and stability. Over time, small victories began to emerge. Ethan, who initially avoided eye contact and rarely spoke, started to open up little by little. One evening, while sketching at the kitchen table, Ethan allowed himself a shy smile when Baron complimented his artwork. "You've got real talent," Baron said warmly, placing a set of new colored pencils in front of the boy. That moment, however small, felt like a breakthrough. Their routine grew steadier, and so did their bond. Baron noticed Ethan beginning to relax, sharing snippets of his day at school or even mentioning bits of his past. "We never ate dinner together at home," Ethan said one evening, his tone matter-of-fact, but laced with lingering sadness. Baron listened carefully, offering quiet reassurance. He didn't push Ethan to say more than he was ready to share. The boy's healing would take time, and Baron was committed to giving him as much as he needed. The journey wasn't without challenges. There were nights when Ethan would wake up crying, haunted by nightmares he couldn't articulate. On those nights, Baron would sit by his side, offering the comfort and protection the boy had so sorely lacked. "You're safe now," Baron would whisper, holding Ethan close until the trembling subsided. Though the process was slow, progress was undeniable. With each passing week, Ethan seemed to trust Baron a little more. His rare smiles became slightly more frequent, and the conversations grew longer. For Baron, each step forward was a triumph, proof that love and patience could mend even the deepest wounds. Before long, Baron found himself contemplating the future. Temporary custody wasn't enough. Ethan needed stability, a forever home. And Baron couldn't imagine his life without the boy who had quietly become the center of it. After weeks of careful thought, Baron scheduled a meeting with the social worker. "I want to adopt Ethan," he said firmly. "He needs a permanent home, and I want to be the one to give it to him." The social worker smiled, her eyes filled with encouragement. "That's wonderful to hear, Baron. Let's begin the process." As the adoption paperwork moved forward, Baron shared the news with Ethan during a quiet dinner. "Ethan," he said gently, "I want to adopt you. I want this to be your home, forever." Ethan's eyes widened, his expression a mix of surprise and hope. After a moment, a small smile crept across his face, and he leaned forward to hug Baron tightly. The gesture spoke louder than any words ever could. Baron knew the road ahead wouldn't always be easy, but he was ready. Together, he and Ethan had created something precious, a real family. And for the first time in a long while, both of them had found a place where they truly belonged. It was a fresh start for both of them, and Baron Garrett knew this new chapter would be pivotal. In those early days, Ethan was guarded, as though testing whether this newfound stability was real or just another fleeting moment in a turbulent life. He carried himself with a cautious air, as if bracing for the inevitable collapse of this fragile sense of security. Baron could sense Ethan's unease in the boy's tentative questions like, "How long will I stay here?" Or, "Are you going to leave me?" Each query cut deep into Baron's heart, a painful reminder of the wounds Ethan carried. Building trust, Baron realized, would be a gradual process. "I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere," Baron would tell him whenever the topic came up, hoping the reassurance would sink in. Yet, deep down, Baron wasn't sure if Ethan truly believed him. As the days turned into weeks, Baron began to establish a steady routine for the two of them. He would wake early to prepare a simple breakfast, walk Ethan to school, and ensure there was always time for shared moments in the evenings. These small, ordinary acts of care might have seemed insignificant to an outsider, but for Baron, they were the foundation of something new and meaningful. Meanwhile, Ethan slowly started adjusting to this structure. Though his smiles were rare and his words sparse, there were signs of progress. One afternoon, Baron noticed Ethan doodling quietly in the corner of the kitchen table. Recognizing the boy's natural artistic talent, Baron encouraged him, buying sketchbooks and colored pencils. "You've got a real knack for drawing," he complimented one day as he admired Ethan's careful lines and figures. The boy's face softened into a shy smile, a genuine expression of joy that Baron realized he had never seen before. As time passed, their bond deepened. Ethan began to show more comfort in Baron's home. Conversations that were once clipped and superficial grew more meaningful. Ethan started sharing snippets about his day at school and opening up, however cautiously, about his past. One evening, as Baron prepared dinner, Ethan quietly remarked, "We never really had dinner together at home. My parents, they were gone a lot." The weight of those words settled heavily in the air, but Baron didn't push for more. Instead, he listened patiently, offering a safe space for Ethan to share at his own pace. Still, this new life came with unexpected challenges. Ethan's nights were often interrupted by bouts of fear, screams, or tears born from nightmares he couldn't articulate. The scars of his trauma were not easily healed. Despite his inexperience, Baron did his best to comfort the boy. "You're safe here, Ethan," he would say softly, holding him close and offering the reassurance Ethan had likely never known. Over time, those fearful nights became less frequent, and Baron began to notice subtle changes. Although the progress was slow, it was undeniable. Ethan was beginning to heal. For Baron, The journey of caring for Ethan brought profound changes within himself. What had initially felt like an obligation gradually evolved into something deeply personal. Where his life had once been a string of monotonous days, he now found purpose. Every little milestone Ethan achieved, whether it was a rare smile, a heartfelt conversation, or a peaceful night, felt like a hard-won victory that Baron celebrated in his heart. Baron discovered a side of himself he hadn't known before, a capacity for love and care that exceeded anything he'd ever experienced. The thought of adopting Ethan began to take root. At first, the idea seemed daunting, clouded by uncertainties. Yet, as the weeks turned into months, the notion began to feel not only plausible but right. By then, Baron had already stepped into the role of Ethan's guardian. They had created a rhythm together, building a home that was beginning to feel genuine. Still, Baron hesitated. The weight of officially becoming Ethan's father was a decision he didn't take lightly. Deep down, however, he knew the answer. The life they had built together was no longer temporary. It was real. Months passed, and Baron and Ethan continued to grow closer. The walls Ethan had built around himself began to crumble, bit by bit. While he still had moments of hesitation and insecurity, his newfound trust in Baron was evident. The boy, who once seemed perpetually braced for abandonment, now showed signs of hope. For Baron, the decision to adopt Ethan became increasingly clear. He couldn't imagine his life without the boy. The daily routines they had established, the deeper conversations they shared, and the quiet moments of connection all pointed toward one undeniable truth. They were family. One evening, as they sat together at the dinner table, Baron looked across at Ethan and took a deep breath. It was time to have the conversation. "Ethan," he began, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. "I've been thinking a lot lately, and I want you to know something important. I'd like to adopt you. I want this to be your home, permanently. What do you think about that?" The room fell silent as Ethan processed the words. His wide eyes shimmered with a mix of disbelief and hope. You really want me to stay?" he asked, his voice trembling. Baron leaned forward, meeting Ethan's gaze. "Yes, Ethan, I want this to be your home forever. I want us to be family." For a moment, Ethan said nothing, but then a smile, a true, radiant smile, spread across his face. Without a word, he rose from his seat and wrapped his arms around Baron in a hug that spoke volumes. It was a silent but powerful answer. At that moment, Baron knew his decision had been the right one. They were no longer just two people sharing a house. They were a family, ready to face the future together. Baron Garrett, who once doubted his ability to raise a child, now found himself more assured with each passing day. He could see how much progress Ethan had made, not only in his physical health, but also in his emotional well-being. The boy, who had once seemed so closed off and braced for inevitable rejection, now carried himself with a quiet confidence. There were still moments of hesitation and uncertainty, of course, but the transformation was undeniable. It was as if Ethan had finally begun to trust that this new home was permanent, that it was his. As time went on, Baron couldn't ignore the growing realization that adopting Ethan was no longer just a possibility, it had become a necessity. He couldn't imagine life without the boy anymore. The routines they had built, the heartfelt conversations, and the deep bond that had formed between them pointed to something far more profound. Baron began to think seriously about Ethan's future, considering questions that weighed heavily on his mind. What if Ethan needs something I can't provide as his temporary guardian? What if someone takes him away? The thought of losing Ethan was unbearable. One sunny afternoon, after picking Ethan up from school, Baron decided it was time to face his feelings head-on. Sitting at the kitchen table, he watched Ethan sketch quietly, the boy's demeanor calm and far more at ease than the nervous child Baron had met months before. That moment of peaceful normalcy solidified Baron's decision in his heart. "I want to adopt Ethan," he whispered to himself, the gravity of the decision settling over him like a heavy but welcome weight. Determined, Baron scheduled a meeting with the social worker to discuss the next steps. Despite his resolve, he felt a knot of anxiety in his stomach, afraid that unforeseen obstacles might derail his plans. But there was no turning back now. When he arrived at the social worker's office, she greeted him warmly, clearly anticipating the reason for his visit. "So, Baron, how are things going with Ethan?" she asked, her expression kind yet inquisitive, as if sensing the importance of this moment. Baron took a deep breath, steadying himself before looking her in the eye. "I want to adopt Ethan," he said firmly. "I can't imagine my life without him anymore. He needs a permanent home, and I want that home to be mine." The words, spoken with such conviction, even surprised Baron himself. The social worker nodded, clearly moved by his determination. "I'm so glad to hear that, Baron. It's clear you and Ethan share a strong bond, and he truly needs that stability. We'll begin the legal process right away." A wave of relief washed over Baron, but it was soon followed by a ripple of anxiety. How would Ethan react to this news? The boy still bore the scars of his past and might find it hard to trust that anything could be forever. That evening, as they sat down for dinner, Baron decided it was time to have the conversation. He took a deep breath, summoning his courage. "Ethan," he began, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. The boy looked up from his plate, curiosity lighting his expression, though a trace of nervousness lingered in his eyes. "I've been thinking a lot lately, and there's something important I need to tell you." Baron leaned forward slightly, meeting Ethan's gaze. "I want to adopt you," he said softly but firmly. "I want you to have a permanent home, a place where you know you're loved and cared for. Forever. What do you think about that?" The room fell into a deep silence. Ethan stared at Baron, his wide eyes shimmering with emotion as he processed the words. For a few seconds, he remained quiet, as if struggling to believe what he had just heard. Finally, his voice, barely above a whisper, broke the silence. "Do you want me to stay here? Forever?" Baron's heart pounded in his chest, but he nodded, his voice resolute. "Yes, Ethan. I want this to be your home, forever. I want to be your family." A flicker of hope crossed Ethan's face, and then, for the first time, a genuine smile slowly spread across his lips. He stood up suddenly and, without a word, wrapped his arms around Baron in a tight embrace. The silent gesture spoke volumes, saying more than words ever could. At that moment, Baron knew he had made the right decision. The long process of paperwork and legal formalities still lay ahead, but for the first time in a long while, both Baron and Ethan felt like they had found where they belonged. Together, as a family. Ethan didn't say anything at first, but then, little by little, a shy smile crept across his face, a smile Baron Garrett had never seen before. It wasn't just a smile, it was a glimpse of genuine happiness. Without uttering a single word, Ethan rose from his seat and wrapped his arms around Baron in a heartfelt hug. The silent gesture, so simple yet profoundly moving, spoke volumes in a way words never could. The days that followed were a whirlwind of legal forms and appointments, but Baron approached each hurdle with determination. With every document signed and every meeting attended, he and Ethan moved closer to making their bond official, solidifying the connection they had already formed in their hearts. The adoption process was anything but quick, yet Barron embraced every challenge, confident that the effort would be worth it in the end. More than anything, he longed for the moment when Ethan would legally become his son. However, deep down, Barron already knew the truth. Ethan was as much a part of his life as the air he breathed, and nothing could ever separate them now. When the final papers were signed, Barron was overwhelmed by a mix of relief and joy that words couldn't fully capture. He understood that this choice would forever alter both of their lives. Ethan, the boy who had unexpectedly walked into his world, was now officially his son. For Barron, it marked the start of a brand new chapter. For Ethan, it was the chance he had so desperately needed, the chance to be cherished, safeguarded, and to finally experience what it meant to belong to a real family. The story of Barron and Ethan is a reminder that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness can lead to the most profound changes in someone's life. Barron wasn't looking to be a hero, but when the moment came, he became exactly what Ethan needed: a father, a protector, and most importantly, family. If this story moved you as much as it did us, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more heartfelt stories that remind us of the beauty of human connection. And hey, share this video with someone who needs a little inspiration today. You never know whose life it could touch. Thank you for watching, and as always, take care, stay kind, and we'll see you next time.